Well, thank you everybody on behalf of NRG and Green Bean for joining us this morning. It's fantastic to see so many of you join us. It's lovely for us to see some different faces to our usual staff on our catch-up calls. We're delighted this morning to be joined by Chico Chakravorty, who is a specialist in diversity and inclusion. Not only is he a specialist consultant, he's a thought leader for diversity and inclusion initiatives and topics, but also has worked tirelessly within BAME recruitment, racial inequality and the LGBT community. So I'm absolutely delighted to have him join us today. He's recently been working with the likes of the House of Commons, Cambridge University, consultancy for AstraZeneca, BlackRock and Snapchat, so some big brands there that have all got this on their agenda as well. So hopefully we'll get some snippets as to what those big organisations are doing and how they're addressing this. But you haven't come on here to speak to me today, although I could talk to you all day long. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to Chico. Thank you, Chico, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Julie. And yeah, no, actually, it would make my life so much easier if you did do most of the talking for the rest of the session. But thank you all so much for joining today. And it's wonderful to see your commitment towards diversity and inclusion. As Julie said, I've got a fairly broad range of experience in terms of diversity, and I think for me a big part of it kind of started early on in my career, well, probably not even my career, probably at school actually, where I realized that the type of school that I went to, which was an ex-grammar school, so it was an all-boys school where you kind of had to do a horrible entrance exam, wasn't necessarily that safe a place for someone who was one of 3 non-white kids and was definitely the only one that was looking at identifying as being a gay male at the time. It just didn't really feel like a safe and pleasant environment for me to be able to thrive in. So what I kind of ended up doing was actually withdrawing an awful lot from what was happening at school, especially with things like games and PE, and actually found myself gravitating more towards classical music, and kind of scheduled all of my violin lessons during that point there. And it was actually there where I actually discovered then joining a local youth orchestra, what an environment where I was able to thrive really looked like. And from that point on, it's always been something that I've tried to replicate in my professional life. So whether that be working as a permanent employee for organisations like the BBC or Bupa, or in my consulting work, it's always been about how do I enable people to find a way that they can truly belong. And I think that that's the one word that tends to often be missing when we start talking about diversity and inclusion. So now I'm going to bring up the really boring bit, the slides. Hopefully they will start coming up now as a proper screen share, and hopefully you'll be able to still see me coming through. But yes, the word that I often see missing in a lot of the diversity work that happens externally is the word belonging. And I think that organizations can really be quite diverse. They can be really broad in terms of the different ethnicities and the different gender identities and people with disabilities in their workforce. But if they're not necessarily included, then we don't necessarily see the benefit of that. But in order for that to happen, I really think that everyone needs that sense of belonging, and that's regardless of what demographic that you fall into. So that's the way that I want us to be able to think about this conversation today for the next 90 minutes. So we're going to be fairly interactive. There are definitely going to be bits where I'm talking. There are definitely going to be bits where I will hopefully be able to get the technology to work to get some polls up and things like that. But hopefully this will give you a little bit of further insight into what we see, not just in our workplaces, but our societies too. Now, most of this will be delivered on here, and as I said, it will hopefully be a little bit participatory, but do put things into the chat function. I might not necessarily see it straight away because obviously my screen is just predominantly the slides that you're seeing, but Julie and the team will be able to kind of feed that through to me. There will be a couple of spots for questions, so kind of as we get to the end of the first tranche and then right at the end. But if there's something that really springs to mind, then do feel free to take yourself off mute and ask that question. I'll either answer it there and then, or I'll signpost for when it comes up later. And then just to kind of think about what it is that we want to really achieve here. So for me, I think the way that I see diversity and inclusion happen across different sectors and different organizations can sometimes be flawed. And the reason for that is we tend to think about this from a particular lens. I am often asked to speak at conferences and events or write content or do whether it's webinars or podcasts, and often when I'm, for example, in a room when we, used to be able to go to conferences and be in a room, I would look out and go, okay, so we are in a LGBT plus conference, and I'm looking out and I can tell that the majority of people here would either identify as being LGBT plus, or they would be maybe one or two people that worked in HR. And I think that part of the problem that we have is we're having the conversations with the wrong people. And potentially sometimes that happens in the wrong way. So when people talk about the different types of cases for diversity and inclusion, some people will sit there and go, well, we really shouldn't be talking about the business case because it's about the ethical case or the moral case. And I sit there and go, of course it is. But if that was enough, then we wouldn't need to be providing that evidence. We wouldn't be seeing where we are here today. And for me, it's about thinking about not what's right for us as individuals trying to drive this agenda forward, but who are the stakeholders that we are looking at trying to influence to enable to make this change. So for example, if we are looking at trying to talk about this to a finance director, being able to have some really clear evidence that articulates what the impact to the bottom line or the business case, the commercial case, is really clear. If you want to have this conversation with your chief executive, it might not necessarily just be the ethical case, but it may well be actually thinking about the strategic case. So thinking about this from different perspectives, not from what feels right to us as individuals, but what actually feels right to the audience and the way that we are trying to communicate with them. So what we're going to cover today is firstly the context, why this is happening right now. What does it mean? We'll have a look at some different terminologies. We'll have a look at some experiences of people in the workplace and in society, and maybe some statistics which may or may not surprise you. And then we'll go into some concepts surrounding privilege, surrounding meritocracy, which I know certainly for many of you in the HR and people functions is going to be really interesting, and also looking at things like micro behaviours. We're then going to... Yeah.
Could you change the view on your slides, because we've got your notes up rather than...
You have got the script up as well. Okay, apologies for that. No, not a problem. Let me see if I can... I might need to come out, stop sharing, and then try it again. Apologies. Yeah, so sometimes you've got to love how tech works in this world, don't you? So let me just make sure that I've got that. And let's see if that's coming up slightly better.
Yes, no notes now. Thanks, Chico.
Perfect. Great, not a problem.
Back, Chico. We've got your notes again.
They are back. Oh, very interesting. So for some reason, okay, let me see how much I can fake it without the notes then. So let me take it off presenter view and we'll kind of go through that. So we will then look at, maybe, no, sorry, I'm just gonna keep on going. So the piece which we're going to then look at is how we can look at being slightly more inclusive. What is it that this means? What is it that we can do in our workplaces that really makes a difference, that takes us towards a place that's slightly more towards belonging, and not just doing this for the sake of it being a compliance exercise or a tick box, etc. We will then look at some quick wins that hopefully you'll be able to implement going through. And as I say, there'll be a point for questions both in the middle of the session and towards the end too. So in terms of why this is important and why this is important right now. See, now my slides won't even move. So there we go. So Black Lives Still Matter. We obviously saw this happen at the beginning or the middle of the year, just as we were getting into lockdown, in terms of the impact that the world saw when we were confronted, both in the news, but also visually across social media, of the death of George Floyd. And it wasn't just his death, it was the death of Trayvon Martin, of Sandra Bland, of Breonna Taylor. And there are names just as powerful here in the UK that we might not necessarily know. The names such as Kingsley Burrell or Darren Cumberbatch. And just a couple of days before George Floyd was killed in the US, Simeon Francis also died in a police cell in Devon. And this is something that we have to sit down and think about. When people are dying at the hands of the authorities that are there to protect us, it sends a really worrying message. And it sends a really worrying message, especially if you are from that demographic. So what we need to think about is, just because the protests aren't happening at the same frequency that we were seeing earlier on in the year, that doesn't mean that these solutions are fixed. So we need to think about what is it that we can do. And whilst a lot of what we will talk about today will cover the elements of race equality, the principles that sit behind it will also apply for most other demographics too. So whether that's disabilities, whether that's religion, whether that's sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, as we go through this session, what I want us to be able to do is I want us to be able to learn. And one of the biggest things that I've seen holding people back during a lot of this is that fear. So we will come onto that in a little bit more detail. But I want you to be able to be clumsily human in this session. I want you to be able to ask questions, even if it might feel a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit tense, or you don't know if you've got the word right or wrong. I will help you along with some of that terminology to make sure that you are using better choices of wording. But do feel free to ask those questions, because without that, we're not going to learn, we're not going to be able to make a difference to people in the workplace. So what I want to do here is think about what is diversity. And this is going to be the first bit where I'm now going to try and change the tech again and see if we can go into a slide, and hopefully if you can go to, in a web browser, either on your phone or on your laptop, if you can go to slido.com, which is SLIDO. And if you should hopefully then, I've just popped this in the chat as well, although I think I might have sent it just to the organisers. So hopefully you should be able to click on that link and go to slido.com. And then I'm going to ask you to put in a code, which is 72741. Again, I'm going to pop that in the chat. And whilst we're there, I want us to think about, what do you associate with the word diversity? So I'm going to hopefully activate this poll, and hopefully you should now be able to type in words. So I want you to type in whatever word you think of when you think about the term diversity. Starting to see some words come through, and this is hopefully going to generate one of those word clouds. Great. We're starting to see lots of words come through, lots of reinforcements of certain things, which is great. Let's keep on going for another 15, 20 seconds or so. So keep on popping in those words that come through. Great, fantastic. Now, hopefully, I'm going to copy a link and pop that into the chat. And hopefully, if you click that, you should start being able to see the results come through. So let's see if that's worked. Can you see those there on your screens? Lots of talk around difference. What I'll also do is I'll share the screen if that is that coming up on your screens? Can someone give me a thumbs up if that link in the chat is working?
The link's not working for me, but I did see word cloud when I was entering the words. Okay, perfect. Why don't I just try and go old school and share that way? So hopefully you can now see it there. So lots of talk about difference. Some really good pieces there in terms of commercial advantage. So we're thinking about the business perspective here. Variety, reinforcing that whole piece on difference, because obviously the breadth that we have there, and also then unique. The other things I'm seeing there is a couple of bits that might make us feel uncomfortable. So saying the wrong thing, or the concept of unconscious bias. Now these are all really, really important for us to understand in terms of how it is that we can then look to mitigate some of those and help to overcome them. So I'm going to hopefully stop sharing that screen, and then we're going to hopefully go back to the slides. Let's double check that. I might actually, I think that was a little bit faffy, so I might take out the other bits of the participatory bit, as it's not quite as smooth as we would like. So in terms of what is diversity, that was a really great effort. So thank you all so much for participating. The way I tend to break this down for clients I work with is I tend to get them to think of diversity from two perspectives. So the first of which is your demographic diversity, the diversity that you would complete on a new joiners survey or when you're applying for a role. So things such as your gender identity, your ethnicity, the religion that you believe in, whether you have a disability or not, your sexual orientation, things like that that you can effectively not really change about yourself. So those are what I call the demographics. And quite often organizations will have a piece where they sort of pop that down and they'll kind of measure that out. But then the other part of what we look at in terms of diversity is our cognitive diversity. How do we think? What are the experiences that we've had? What has our education been? There's a really interesting study by a psychologist called Jim Rohn, and then I think it was then furthered out by a gentleman called David Burkus, who basically talk about the fact that we are an amalgamation of the 5 to 10 closest people to us in our lives. So if we think about the people that we really go to solicit that insight, that thought, that point of discussion, is really interesting, because there'll probably be 1 or 2 family members, so maybe a parent or a partner, a spouse, some close friends that we have grown up with, maybe 1 or 2 people at work or from a social organization that we're part of. But we tend to also go to those people because they might look like us or feel like us or think like us. So actually the point about us reinforcing that cognitive diversity can be
really powerful. If we just think about how we see this play out, for example, on social media, because we tend to be friends with people that are similar, when you have big challenges such as Brexit, you will tend to see more people in your social media channel echoing the same views that you do, the echo chamber effect. So what we need to do is think about, how is that limiting us in terms of if everyone looks and thinks and feels the same as us? And you can see really clear business examples, through the ages. So for example, when Swiss Air collapsed, they used to be considered as the flying bank, but because their leadership team was so homogenous in their experience, in their drivers, in their motivation, they were completely blindsided by the changes that were happening in the aviation industry, and therefore were then had to be bought out by a parent organization. Similarly with H&M, they had a marketing campaign in South Africa where they had a little t-shirt for a boy that said "cutest monkey in the jungle." And they put that on a black child without realizing the implications and the severity of having, and the sort of legacy impact of having a black child referred to as a monkey, because no one around the table thought about it. No one had even had that experience. So because everyone thought the same, they had a massive reputational damage, both in the market and internationally, because that leadership team that did that were not broad enough in terms of how that came through. So that is, in a nutshell, what diversity is. And the next bit I want us to think about is then like maybe a quick whistle-stop tour. So one of the big things that we're talking about here is going to be race. And the Cambridge University definition of racism is where you have either an institution, a structural or a systemic policy or process or barrier that will favor one demographic over another, and will treat the other demographic negatively, purely based on their ethnicity. So for example, an institutional example of racism may well be that in a particular university, that 25% of students will have a first, will be white, but only 10% of students that get a first are black. Now, what is it that prevents black students being able to attain those firsts? Are they less intelligent? No. Is there something that is preventing them in terms of how those faculty members are viewing them, for example? So that's one example of institutional racism. So it's within an organization. You then go into systemic racism, which is when people tend to find themselves at that bias, that prejudice that we've just described, not just at a institutional level, but slightly broader than that. So it may well be within a particular sector. So for example, if you looked at the asset management field, only 1% of asset managers in the UK are black. Now, there may well be lots of different reasons for that. And it may well be that actually the criteria that asset managers use are, we want the best, and this is something that we'll definitely come on to. But if the best is defined as, someone that's come out of Oxbridge, for example, and Oxbridge are continually in the press for having very low participatory numbers from people who are black, is that any wonder that we're not seeing that reflected through? The last one would be structural racism. So where laws and policies and procedures that are influenced not just by institutions, but also by government will be something that impacts people negatively. Recently, I have been on the receiving end of this. I have never been stopped by the police, and in the past 6 weeks, my car has been pulled over twice by the police. And just when they were doing random stop and searches, with a police officer looking in my windscreen at my face and then pulling me over. That might not be the reason, but that's certainly what it feels like to me. So that would be an example of a structural racism that's played out. Another term that we would like to look at is bias. And again, it's about how do we either favour a particular demographic or treat another demographic poorly, purely based on that particular characteristic that they have. So whether that be gender, whether that be their sexual orientation, whether that be their ethnicity, etc., or whether it's something slightly less qualifying than that, such as the type of university they went to. Do we think that people are only good if they went to Oxbridge or a Russell Group university, etc.? There will be a term that, and I think one of you brought that up on the word cloud, which is unconscious bias. And these are things that we don't even realize that we are doing. So it's the things that sit behind us that effectively society has ingrained that way of operating, of thinking in our mindsets. And what can we do to then look at overcoming some of those things? Often see these in the recruitment process. So it'll be really interesting to touch on this with yourselves later. One of the other things that we love to talk about is actually intersectionality. So when we've looked at those different demographics, some people may well, like myself, come from more than one of those different protected characteristics. So as I said, both my parents are from an Indian background. I'm also a gay male. So I'm part of the LGBT plus community, and I'm also of a different ethnicity. So basically being intersectional is when you are two or more different demographics that tend not to have the same opportunity and privilege through society. It tends to be proven that the more demographics you belong to or identify with will tend to impact you more disproportionately in a negative way. But then there are also some really positive words, and one of my favorites is allyship. And allyship is where we have people that stand by the side of those less fortunate demographics in our society, in our workplaces, and they really stand up for those causes. So the fact that NRG are putting on this event today to help you all in terms of your journey on diversity and inclusion is really, really meaningful, because it shows their allyship to wanting to change this in the world that we work in. But surely we can separate our political views and our business views, right? Absolutely. But the problem is the world is getting much smaller. Recently, I was doing some research and I was looking at something about the business case of diversity, and I got taken to an article on the Financial Times website, and seeing some of the comments that came through on there was really interesting, because it wasn't just the fact that those comments exist. I know those comments exist. I wouldn't be in a job if they didn't. But also the fact that someone is quite happy to effectively put out a read receipt for their very blatant prejudice that can impact them. In terms of, for example, the example that we saw in the US with Amy Cooper walking her dog in Central Park off lead in an area that had to be on lead. And when a black man asked her to put her dog on lead to conform with the regulations of that park, she called the police and weaponized his race by saying, "I am feeling very threatened by an African American in Central Park right now." Thankfully, her organization had done an awful lot on diversity and inclusion. And when this made the media, they fired her. Because actually, it's something that if those views you're happy to have outside, how are you going to be able to distinguish those when you come into the workplace? How is that going to impact on somebody's well-being in the office, and therefore on their productivity, their engagement levels? And how does that then transfer through your entire people culture? So let's have a look at some race issues at work. Now, this is going to be really awkward because without the stats, it's really difficult, but I'll see how many of these I can remember. So I think in the UK, what I'm going to also do is just caveat this in terms of some of it might feel uncomfortable to hear. It might make us sort of squirm a little bit. And this isn't about saying that we are good or bad people purely based on our ethnicity or different things like that. But it is about how can we make a real difference. And therefore, we need to actually understand some of the baseline data that sits behind this. So a report done by, I believe, Business in the Community showed that of the that I think it's 3.9 million people that are designated either as a manager, senior leader, or director in the UK. Only 1.5% of those people were Black, which equated to about 55,000. 55,000 out of 3.9 million. And bearing in mind, the UK population has, I think, a demographic of 3.5% of people that come from Black backgrounds and 13.9% that come from a wider BAME background or people of colour. So that is a really shockingly low number, definitely not proportionate with how our society looks. There was a study that was done by the Centre of Social Investigation at Nuffield College last year at Oxford, which showed that people of colour had to send out 80% more job applications in order to get the same positive response that they were getting from other than their white counterparts were getting. The other thing that that we will see is not only that prejudice exists, but it actually remains pretty much unchanged from a study that was conducted back in 1969. So the level of racism towards Blacks and people that were either Pakistani or Bangladeshi in particular had not changed at all. So those are some really, really worrying statistics. There are some really positive things that you can also see from the McGregor-Smith review, which showed that actually that there would be an increase in annual GDP on our entire economy of, I think, 1.3% or 24 billion if we had full representation across our labour market, which is really, really critical. So that's about some race issues at work. I'm now going to show you about some race issues in society. This image might shock you, but basically it's the difference that we see when we type in the word Black instead of white into the sentence 3 teenagers on Google. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is not to kind of say that Google's obviously operated by people that are racist. They're not, but if the bias that goes into our AI exists, we're always going to see that artificial intelligence replicating that. And that's something that's really, really dangerous for us to be able to think of. And especially when we think about recruitment, because there are so many tools out there that kind of purport to take away a lot of the bias in the recruitment processes. And we'll definitely talk about some of those later on. A couple of other quick stats for you are, so again, bearing in mind that 13% of, 13.5% of the UK population come from different ethnicities. In a study done by Shelter, 38% of people that were from a BAME background were homeless, that were statutory homeless in 2017. That's a really difficult number for us to sit down and look at. Black African women are 7 times more likely to be detained by the police than white British counterparts. So we can see actually some of these differences that come through in terms of just how we look, but it helps us to start thinking about, does that explain certain behaviors? Does that explain where we see people and how we think about people if these issues are so ingrained in our societies? Now, what I'm going to do is hopefully play a video for you. And it's a really, I don't know how many of you may well have seen this. It was from a Channel 4 documentary earlier on this year. But it's a really heartwarming moment in terms of understanding the concept of privilege. Now, before we do this, I don't want us to think that privilege is a bad thing, because it's not. It just happens to be what it is. I'm not saying that if we talk about the concept of white privilege, that all white people have an easier life. It just means that they are not disproportionately affected purely based on the color of their skin, in the same way that we see that for male privilege or for straight privilege. Now I'm going to try and play it from here. It might not work, but I have got I've got the video backed up, so bear with me 2 seconds. We shall hopefully share the right screen.
We are going to be running a race. However, your starting position in this race will be decided by the answers to questions that we are going to be asking you.
Say what? It's a joke.
This activity is intended to explore how society favours one race over others.
People often confuse white privilege with being wealthy or being rich, and it isn't about that. What it's about is the absence of having to live with the consequences of racism.
Now, if the question applies to you, you will take a big step forward. If the answer to the question doesn't apply to you, you stay where you are.
I better win, man.
Okay, make sure you're on the start line. I see some cheaters already.
Yeah, Father.
Feet behind the line.
If English is your parents' first language, take a step forward.
Oh, yeah.
If you have ever been the only person in the room of your race, take a step backwards.
For God's sake!
If you've never been asked where you come from, take a step forward.
If you have never had to be worried about your family being stopped and searched, take a step forward.
I don't get worried about if people ask me to stop and search.
The divide widens, and the inequality of their position becomes clear.
This is just like not fair now. Farah, none of us are white. None of us are white. It's unfair.
The last question. If your parents have ever warned you about racism, take a step backwards.
If we were about to start a race, is this a fair starting point for us all? No. Mackay, how do you feel standing there in the field of runners?
I kind of feel a bit alone. I can't really see it. I'm literally just by myself, more or less. I'm just a bit frustrated and annoyed that society nowadays really isn't fair. And I just wish everybody could be equal.
Farah!
It's kind of frustrating that, like, me and Sarah are just standing at the back here while the majority of people who may be white are, like, standing right at the front. That just frustrates me a bit, because it's almost as in what society is today. I don't want this to be how it is, but it is, so it just gets a bit frustrating.
Henry, how are you feeling being right at the very front?
It feels quite weird because if you think about it, I think all of us should be at the same point, but sadly the questions, the ways that they were put didn't favour some people, which I think is quite unfair.
On your marks, get set, go!
How did that make people feel? I would love to hear people's thoughts and reflections on that that video. What are people thinking? Did that resonate with them? Did they feel that that was something that they tend to see? Did it bring up new concepts? Sorry, apologies. I'm going to quickly stop that video from playing.
That really upset me, that Chico. I've got goosebumps. That was really shocking to see that, and those children clearly hadn't been primed as to what was about to happen, and that was really sad for me. Does anybody else come off mute and share what their thoughts were?
I think the visual it created was really powerful, because you talk about it, but to actually see how they all started from a different point was really, really powerful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam. Any other thoughts?
Sorry, I think someone was ahead of me. Louise, you go for it. I'll go next.
All right, it was just to say pretty much what's just been said, Chico, in that, you know, it is actually the visual, when you see it visually, it has such a profound effect, and it makes me feel quite sad, actually, you know, but equally hearing those young people speak in the way that they did, to say that it's not fair and it's not right, it also kind of generates a bit of hope to think that in that next generation we can change things, you know.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. Richard and then Dan.
Yeah, I think, well, it's pretty, it's quite a stark reminder, isn't it? It's quite sobering to watch. And I mean, I'm sure it doesn't apply just to race either, but it's particularly prevalent to race, I'm sure. I'm sure there are other ways in which we could use that. I think it's a training resource. I would use it, or I would encourage my people to. And I think probably as a parent as well, it makes you think, doesn't it? Not just when I think about work now, I think about my kids, and I think, well, actually, do their friends, you know, are their friends on the receiving end, or what do my own children think? Yeah, it's very, very powerful. So thank you.
Absolutely. Dan, and then I think Patrick also wanted to say something, and then we'll carry on from there.
Yeah, thanks, Chico. I've actually I'd seen that video before from an American context at college. Yep. So it wasn't as shocking because I'd seen the portrayal before. But what I would say is, it's the perspective around it. It's children in this video. It's not adults. It's not people who have been allowed to formulate opinion. It's children who are at the same starting point. You know, the same in terms of age and opportunity. And when you talk about that thing earlier on about that homogenous people who look, feel, think the same. It's a reminder that actually, in an educational standpoint, you know, for the large majority of the country, we all, in that educational format and in that area environment, everybody comes together as one, you know, and seeing children, you know, we develop these inequalities as we go through life. So it was just from that standpoint, it's really quite poignant to see.
Absolutely.
You know,
and I think it's really interesting when we start questioning where those inequalities come from, because, you know, I think we've probably all seen images or videos of the sort of innocence and the purity and the inclusiveness that children, you know, up to the age of 4 or 5 have, when, you know, that's not starting to come through. And then you start seeing where those influences come in terms of, you know, whether it be the playground and different parents having different parenting styles and thoughts, etc. is really interesting to see where those come from. Patrick.
Yeah, just very quickly, just to say that I've used that exercise a number of times. I was part of the original MESMAC, Men Who Have Sex with Men, Action in the Community. It was an HIV prevention program. And we worked a lot with health workers, the police, with social care workers, and we used that car park exercise to just outline some of the inequities that existed for gay and bisexual men, but also could have been applied to lesbians, bisexual people, trans people as well, around, you know, the levels of comfort had around holding your partner's hand in public, you know, if anybody had ever been stopped by the police, blah, blah, blah. And it was a really powerful exercise to do with people, because people don't think they've got these prejudices or these privileges inherent in who they are. And it's a really brilliant visual way of just demonstrating how that is. It works around things like class as well as race and sexual orientation and disability.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Patrick. And I think, you know, from my perspective, I've seen that video a few times now, and something always comes out slightly differently each time. And I think that version, seeing Henry, the boy at the end, kind of explaining his kind of discomfort with how he felt that everyone should be on the same place, but sadly the questions didn't favor certain people. I am really excited to see how that thought is then planted in his mind in terms of, so what can I do to change it? How can I then be the sort of catalyst to enable my privilege to be used in a more constructive way that enables people that might not necessarily have that same level of privilege to go through in the same rate. So, Scott, yes, very quick.
Chico, could I just say, what I noticed from the video was that the kids at the front of that pack were just as uncomfortable as the ones at the back. Maybe not just as uncomfortable, but we're still uncomfortable. And you know, I come from the wrong group really to be talking about diversity. I'm a white male, heterosexual. You know, but we still want the change. We want this change to happen.
And I think that's really important, Scott, is that actually we acknowledge there is no wrong group when it comes to talking about diversity. You might not necessarily have the lived experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't want to be part of the change. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use your platform and your position to be able to affect change. And I think that's really critical here. And that's where I come at this from a sense of belonging. Because if I sat there as a straight white male at an organization like a PwC, etc., and I sat there going, I'm doing really well and I keep on exceeding expectations and everything, but I'm seeing a female leadership program and I'm seeing a BAME mentoring program. So why am I even going to bother? What's in it for me? That's the really difficult piece. And I completely get why those schemes exist, because we don't, and we're literally just about to come onto this, because we don't see people equally. But at the same time, if we are disengaging what in effect is potentially, I don't know, 40, 60, 70% of our workforce, we are doing a massive disservice for all the positive things that we're trying to actually enable within our workplaces. So we have to think really carefully about how we craft these environments and make sure that everyone feels like they belong, not just certain demographics. Right, I'm going to go back to sharing these slides. So hopefully you can see those again, and hopefully it will go into, there we go, perfect. So that was the concept of privilege. Now the next bit that I want to talk about is the myth of meritocracy. Now this was probably one of the biggest challenges that I always faced when I was the managing director of an executive search firm based in London. We worked with organisations like, we worked with the Houses of Parliament, we worked with the Mayor of London's office, we worked with large corporates like PwC and Bauer Media, etc. And all they always wanted to do was hire the best person for the job, the person with the most skills. And I completely get that. That seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But is it? If we think about it, meritocracy is not ever really true. It's about how we view this. It's about how those structural privileges that society place on us enable that to happen. So let's think about what it is that a traditional application process or attraction process may well warrant and how that would favor certain people. Let's go back a few steps. So quite often we would think of someone that went to like a really good university, like an Oxford, a Cambridge, a Harvard, Yale, whatever that might be, to be a really good, strong candidate for the role because they have managed to push and achieve themselves to be able to get there. But actually, if we think about it, if they have come from a place where they were at a school which was probably fee paying, which effectively preps you to be able to pass those exams to get you into Oxbridge, and you come from, for example, a little bit of family affluence, which enabled you to have some good tutors and potentially some coaching for either sports that enabled you to be on the county cricket team, or to have a really nice instrument and some good instrumental lessons, which meant that you were a member of the National Youth Orchestra. And then, you know, whilst you were in your sixth form, your dad, who worked at, I don't know, one of the big four, brought you in to do your work experience there. How does that equate in terms of you getting 3 A's at A level and getting into Oxford to someone who may well have gone to the local comp, who may well come from a single parent family, who may well have had to work to be able to provide food for the family, or have caring responsibilities for family members? Are those two lots of 3 A's equal? In my mind, they're not. But that's the problem that we see with meritocracy, is actually we see what's presented to us. We see how we are taught to see by society. And actually, in the case of student A, not only did they have a certain amount of privilege in terms of the ability to kind of go to a good school that would prep you to get into a university, but it would also teach you an awful lot about things like confidence and actually that level of self-belief, which means that you don't have those same levels of fear when it comes to putting yourself forward for situations and being able to do things, which means that you're going to, again, be seen in a very different way. So we need to think about actually what is the meritocratic way of hiring. Is it purely based on qualifications and experience? The one thing that I always struggled with was you could put some great achievements on a CV, but actually there is nothing there that articulates how you got those achievements. So you might have, as a sales leader, exceeded your sales targets by 300% year on year. But how many people did you trample over to do that? How many people felt completely disengaged that your organization kept on prioritizing you because of the results that you were driving, but actually you completely desecrated the culture within your team? These are the things that we need to really think about when we're starting to consider how we hire. Do we hire purely based on these qualifications and experiences, or do we actually try and do things like finding out what people's attitudes are like? Quite often the questions we ask will lead people to an answer that we want to give them. So I always find the really classic one is, tell me about when something went wrong at work and what you did to rectify it. Those last few words changed that entire question completely. And the reason for that is you are giving the candidate an opportunity to hear what you want to hear, which is how they turned a negative into a positive. But what you're not necessarily hearing is they might have done that once, but 50 times they were actually the negative, and that just stopped there. And there's a great book out by Mark Murphy called Hiring on Attitude, which talks about actually if you reframe that question to being just, tell me about something that went wrong at work, you tend to find that people will fall into one of two different categories. They will either be problem bringers, and they will tell you who was to blame, why it went wrong, why they didn't bother getting involved because they knew it would be a waste of time. And then you get the problem solvers that will tell you what happened in that instance. But not just that, they will also find a way to be able to articulate what it was that they tried to do, what went right, what went wrong, what they learned as part of it. And that for me is much more important in terms of a potential candidate coming in and influencing my culture than whether they were able to exceed their sales targets 3 years on a row. Now, the last principle that we're going to talk about here is the one of microaggressions and micro behaviors. So these are things that you may well have heard of as a term. It basically is something that is either said to an individual, not necessarily intended as something negative, but it's something that will continually look at eroding the confidence, both professionally and personally, of that particular individual. The one I often hear an awful lot is you're very eloquent or well-spoken or articulate. And I sit there and kind of think, well, are you saying that to me just purely because I'm brown? Or do you say that to literally every person you meet that speaks with a particular accent? It's a really insulting way, but without necessarily meaning to be insulting, that actually if you come from a certain ethnicity that you aren't able to speak particularly well. And another example I've had in job interviews as well is where am I from? And apparently Maidenhead in Berkshire is not an appropriate answer to that question. And I'm sure that none of you would do that, but these are things that actually happen. But if we think about these things that continually happen to people of color, to people that are LGBT+, people with disabilities, etc., we see how those continual erosions are going to affect. And some people may well, therefore, choose how they then interact with those people. They may well start being slightly more defensive and slightly more guarded and terse in their behaviors, which, if you aren't aware of everything that's happened to them behind the scenes before you ask a particular question, you might think that actually, and it sort of helps to continue the stereotype of, the angry Black activist or the angry gay activist or whatever demographic that is. We need to start thinking about actually what is making them angry. How can we stop that anger from happening? And what can we do in order to help them go through? So now what we're going to do is look at how we can turn the dial on this, because I think that's really important for us to be able to do things and to be able to do it in a constructive and a positive way. Now, I kind of talked earlier in terms of one of the biggest things that I saw across social media and whilst talking to various C-suite leaders that I was working with, was that fear of getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing. And I completely understand that. It's a really difficult world to navigate. But I think there also needs to come a point that actually we need to allow ourselves to be clumsily human on this. And I think that's a really important skill for us to develop. We need to have confrontational conversations or uncomfortable discussions that might not necessarily be things that we want to say or hear or do because they don't intrinsically feel nice. But without having them, we're never going to know what we're doing. But also, more importantly, you're saying to your workforce, to your customer base, to your client partners, etc., that this really isn't important to you. So what we need to do is think about how it is that we can start creating this environment that makes us slightly better. So the first thing I would suggest is learn about lived experiences of people that are different to you. So there are blogs out there are videos out there. There's a great video, and I will share these slides, so you'll see the storyboard of these slides. But there is a great video that is in the resources at the end of those slides, which is called Systemic Racism Explained. It's based in the US, but the principles are still the same. Start looking at those videos and watching them and reading them and start thinking, okay, how would I feel if these decisions about my life were put upon me purely because when I was at secondary school, my first maths teacher was female? Things that you fundamentally cannot change about your life. Think about putting yourself in that perspective. The next one is practice active listening. So when you are having conversations with people, actually listen to what they are saying. Sit down and really think about the body language. Think about where you're looking. Think about the words that you are using that help engage those people through. It's also really useful to start thinking about how can you reinforce some of those messages in a constructive way, in a place of I'm trying to do good here. And by maybe using different language, but it reinforces the point just to make sure that both parties are on the same page. The next thing is make sure that you validate and you don't dismiss. That can be really, really important. I had an experience once with a colleague who had gone to a manager and had basically said that they felt that they were being bullied by a particular individual. The manager chose not to actually investigate it or do anything about it, but actually instead dismissed the person that was working for that organization. And I just sat there and thought, I mean, from an ethical perspective, that's horrific on so many levels. But actually what you're doing is you're enabling that doubt to continue perpetuating in that individual's mind in terms of, was it them, was it not? The fact that, I'm not necessarily saying the individual was right or wrong, but the fact that you would choose to dismiss them without even investigating because it was too difficult for you to do is a really, really difficult thing for that individual as well. So make sure that when you're doing this, that you're not dismissing what their experiences are or what their feelings are in terms of how they are having those experiences at work. This next one might be really uneasy, but you need to be vulnerable. People may well say things to you that might not feel comfortable for you to hear. You might sit there and kind of go, I don't know why we have no one that is a person of color above senior manager in my organization. I don't know. And this isn't about how do we defend those rights or those decisions, but it's about how do we sit there and listen to it and actually go, okay, you have said this, I need to hear it. Because that is a really, really important thing. And I think also the point that we need to hear means that as leaders, sometimes we can't go straight into solutionizing mode, that we just know, or we assume that we know how to fix a particular conversation. We need to allow some space or some breath in that conversation. The next piece is be curious and be genuinely curious. I think that's really important for us in terms of how we get through in terms of the answers that we need to hear. And I think also it's not just the answers that we need to hear, but the way we solicit that information. So thinking about when you're asking questions, perhaps asking, could you help me to understand how? Or could you tell me about something? Shows that you're really leaning in and reaching to that individual to communicate on their terms. It's not a really directive instruction, which is, I need to know. It's something that's showing that level of empathy that enables someone to know that you're doing this for the right reason and you want to make a difference. You also need to be slightly respectful of that curiosity because not everyone is going to want to tell you about their experiences of racism or sexism or homophobia. You need to think about what it is that you can do to create an environment that enables people to feel free to do that without actually having to do that because they're instructed to. This one's going to sound slightly less natural and probably slightly counterintuitive. Ask, but also don't ask. There are going to be times where you will see things in your workplace, in society, etc., which you fundamentally don't agree with. Now, what you don't need to do in that situation is ask for permission to challenge someone's bad behavior. You can just go ahead and do that straight away. If you see something that makes you feel uncomfortable, you don't even need to say, that makes me feel uncomfortable because there's a black person in the room. You can just say, that language is not at all in the spirit of what this organization does, and we're not going to permit. But then also, we need to start thinking about when we ask. So if we are involved as allies in terms of how we can support certain demographics, it's about making sure that we are giving them the platform, the opportunity to drive this forward should they want to. Not assuming that they will want to, but giving them the opportunity to do that. And for us as allies to stand at the back of the room to push that forward, as opposed to taking that glory ourselves in terms of thinking about what it is that we can do. The next one is, if you were doing any level of insight gathering, if you're doing any surveys, if you're doing any interviews, you need to act upon that insight swiftly and accurately. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do everything that you were given as a data point. from your people when you're soliciting that information. But you need to think about how you take this forward, because actually the worst thing is not being consciously acted against because of who you are. It's being consciously acted against. It's doing so with that knowledge of the fact that you asked me what was important to me, I told you, and now you're carrying on not doing that. So you really need to think about that. And also, when you are gathering that information, you need to think about how you're gathering it. Think about the different types of neurodiversity, for example, that people may well have. So some people might be socially confident, or might be slightly more extroverted and happy to share those thoughts in a plenary discussion or in a focus group. Other people might not feel as comfortable and would want a one-to-one, or not even talk about it and be able to fill out a survey by text. So make sure that you give as many different options that you can. It feels like it might be a little bit more work at the front end, but definitely think about how you can collect that. Now, the last piece, and I want you to start thinking about, are there any questions? There'll be a space for questions in a minute. But if there is anything that you can be in this particular world, be kind. It's the one thing that will get you forward. I remember taking a director level role at an organization. It was a fairly broad organization. And I sat there and I thought that I had joined a company that had great ethics, etc., and felt like there was great employee engagement. On my second week in the organization, they'd released staff survey results where 69% of the staff were either disengaged or actively disengaged. That was not the culture I thought I was walking into. And my role had nothing to do with people culture. But I sat there and I analyzed the data, and I kind of sat there and thought, the great thing here is actually the things that we can do to improve this are going to cost us absolutely nothing. It was about a leadership team that was seen as being very hierarchical, would helicopter into situations that felt very aloof and distanced from the rest of the world. And I just basically said, I want everyone to walk down the corridors whenever they're walking in between meetings, coming in for the day or going out for lunch, etc., to smile and say hello. See how that makes a difference. Within 6 months, that number had come down by 40% in terms of the level of engagement. Now, you also kind of have to sit there and act upon some of those things, but that level of engagement that your leadership shows can be something that's incredibly powerful to that. So that would be what I would leave you with in terms of some principles that you can apply, not just to people from different ethnicities, but from any different demographic to you. Those 8 principles. So hopefully they will start sparking through. But I would love to know, in terms of what the next steps are, how can we do some of these things? So I'm going to, before we go into this, what are we going to do? I would love to hear what you are thinking. Are there any questions that you currently have at the moment? So I'm going to stop sharing these slides. If you have any questions right now, either pop them into the chat if that suits you slightly more, or take yourself off mute and ask away.
Great. Would anybody, Chico, that was absolutely fantastic. It was so thought-provoking, and it's certainly raised a lot of questions in my mind in terms of how we can help our clients and engage with our clients to do things differently. Would anyone like to start off with the questions?
If there are no questions right now, there's also questions at the end. So don't feel like this is your only opportunity. But I just wanted to make sure that you didn't have to collect them all the way through for an hour and a half, if there was a point that you wanted to make right now.
I think I don't necessarily have a question right now, but just to say I think the content is really giving me an opportunity to, I think I'm going to take some like reflection after this and think of what we do as an organisation and where there'll be areas that we need to maybe to improve, or to sort of train the staff on that unconscious bias where it might exist. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, certainly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Sam. Patrick.
Yeah, just something about, I think it was really a good presentation, and I know as an organisation we've introduced kind of values-based recruitment, with a set of questions that are not based on people's skills or abilities, so it's kind of, blind recruitment, and then we very, very clearly ask questions about respect, around what contribution have you made to your organisation's inclusivity agenda, and that has changed. I think some of the decisions we've made about very senior management positions in the trust and in the council that I work for. So that's
fantastic.
The other thing is around introducing something into our leadership training around the courage to challenge and bravery as leadership, because I think that's sometimes what's missing. People are just so uncertain about challenging, usually things around race and around transgender issues, to be perfectly honest. So
Absolutely.
kind of include something in there around developing that courage to challenge safely.
Fantastic. No, thank you. And I think that's really important in terms of making sure that we are thinking about value-based recruitment, in terms of, I think we've probably all at some point worked with that one person in the office who is a little bit toxic, a little bit of a drain in terms of saps the energy from you as an individual, as a team, and think about how quickly that toxicity can permeate through your organization. Think about flipping it. What would happen if you were able to do that with positivity, with constructive progress within your teams? The more people you have like that, the more that becomes the norm within your organizational culture. And that's where you start seeing real results, because people are then more engaged. If people are more engaged, they're more likely to be productive. If people are more productive, you're getting better results, which means that you're getting bigger bonuses, which means that your growth is going to be better, which means that you can actually go for those opportunities going forward in your next role in a much more authentic and valuable way. Nikki.
Hi, Chico. Thank you very much. It's been really interesting to listen to that today. Just a question for me. So I'm a director of a building society in the Northeast. Obviously, most of us from the Northeast on the continent. Geographically, it doesn't help in terms of diversity and broadening that. Darlington has a particularly low representation, and what we're finding is everything you've kind of talked about is very much driven in our culture, but we're not driving applications in a wider background because of the Northeast. And I just wondered, again, I'm part of the working group with the Building Societies Association that are looking at this, because the financial sector, as you'll probably appreciate, is also not particularly great.
Absolutely.
What's your advice to get started on attraction and trying to address this systemically at the beginning? Thank you.
Yep. Absolutely. So I'll quickly answer this and then do a little bit more in terms of some quick whistle stop final slides. But I think it's very much thinking about two different things. One is the message that we're putting out. So actually thinking about being really open and honest in terms of where we are on our journey and what we're trying to achieve. So making sure that in our recruitment packs, we're actually articulating the fact why we want a more diverse workforce, why we think that this is going to be a benefit not just to our organization, but to our societies, etc. But then also thinking about, it's great to kind of put that wording in, but if we're still talking to the same people, like I was saying earlier, that I'm, often at speaking at a BAME event and 80% of the people in the audience are people of color, then I know that actually these are not the people that we're thinking about. So actually thinking about where it is that we can advertise these opportunities to be able to attract different audiences, because you can have as much messaging as you want, but if it's not going to the right people, then that's never going to be seen. So there are some great organizations out there that kind of do some of that, and you'll be able to research those in terms of trying to hit certain demographics, and just being really open and honest in your wording, kind of saying we're at the beginning of a journey, we want you to be part of that, is a really critical thing. Jill, yes, very quickly.
To better understand if people are masking their authentic self at work.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't hear the beginning of the question.
What can we do to better understand if people are masking their authentic self at work?
Really interesting. Right, so let me see. I think I have this in one of my next slides. Let me just quickly double check. So people cover up to 83% of who they are. Exactly what you have just said, Jill. There's a brilliant professional out there called Mike Robbins who talks about the concept of covering up. And this is really interesting because people will cover up 4 key elements of who they are. So one, their appearance, the way they might style their hair or the clothes that they wear, or particularly, grooming. Another thing that they may well do would be their associations. So who are they talking to in the office? What are their affiliations? Are there things that particularly would identify them as belonging to a particular community? And then the last one is their advocacy. They may well not necessarily talk about the actual things that they truly believe in, because it might not necessarily feel particularly comfortable at work. Now, on average, 61% of people do this. That goes up to 83% of people who are LGBT+. So you will see that obviously a number of people don't necessarily come out and therefore are their authentic self. But actually that number is up to 45% for people that would identify as being straight, white, and male. And I think this is really interesting for 2 different reasons. One, I'm sure at some point you may well have either come across or had to sign a non-disclosure agreement or work on a secret squirrel project at work, whether that be a restructure, etc. And you're constantly sat there thinking about, I can't let anybody else know what's going on right now. This secret can't get out. How much of your mental load do you take up in terms of having to protect that secret? It means that you're not always going to be focusing on what you're able to. Some people obviously have different neurologies and they will find it easier to compartmentalize these things. But actually, the majority of people that are working through on this will sit there and go, this is really difficult for me to hide. I'm constantly thinking about not disclosing this particular fact. But also, if we look at those stats and we flip them, so if I only know between 17 and 55% of what's important to my team, to my staff, what their motivators are, what their drivers are, how can I manage them effectively? How, if I'm just making the assumption that, they want to earn more money so they can buy a bigger house and get more space, I have no idea if that's right. Or actually, if they want to work 3 days or 4 days a week instead and actually not earn more money, but have a different quality of life. And I think in terms of how do we help people unmask themselves, it's by creating that culture of openness. It's about having examples, having role models that will talk about things like their mental health journey or coming out as being LGBT+, having speakers come in and talk in different ways that help to engage your workforce, to show them the values that they can bring if they are their true authentic selves. These are all things that I think are really important for us to be able to think of, because the more we do that, the less of our minds we're using to protect something that we really shouldn't have to protect. So let's have a quick look at some quick wins and then go into another set of questions if anyone else has any other thoughts. Just to say, I can go over 12:30. I'm sure many of you have got another session or just want to make a sandwich before your 1 o'clock. But let's have a look at some quick wins. This is going to sound really counterintuitive again, but don't try and be too inclusive on this. If you were talking about a particular demographic, whether it be race, whether it be people that are from the LGBT+ community, don't then try and think about, but surely all lives matter. It's not just Black lives, or bring in another demographic. And quite often what will happen is when people are talking about race, someone will also talk about socioeconomic diversity and different classes. What you're effectively doing is another microaggression by doing that. Of course, that is important. We're not saying that. But if you're saying that to someone that's trying to open up to you and be vulnerable in a really uncomfortable way, you're effectively ranking them, and you're saying that actually, because I think that we should be also talking about this, you're effectively saying, I don't think you're as important as this other demographic. And that's really, really difficult for that person to hear. So think about how you can just sit there, enable that space for the conversation. The things, again, that we've talked about, those 8 different techniques, they're all going to be really useful to help you address all of the different demographics. You don't always have to bring those all up at the same time. There are some tech things that may well help you. So in Office 365 and in Microsoft Word and other Microsoft things, you can click on File, go down to Options, and then go to Proofing. And in the same way that you get the red and the blue squiggles that give you spelling mistakes and grammatical errors, there are now inclusivity recommendations in terms of highlighting things that you may well have said in a job description, that such as, we're looking for someone that's young and energetic, that obviously demonstrates an age bias or a cultural bias or a gender bias. So you can use those things. Also, there is a tool called Textio. Obviously, these assess the words that you've put in. They don't necessarily assess the words that you haven't, that could potentially help you attract new candidates that you wouldn't previously have reached before. This, for me, is really critical. Think about culture add, not culture fit. Effectively, if we're talking about culture fit, we're talking about bias again. We're talking about how do we get people that think like us? How do we get people that behave like us? And again, it's one of the things that I always love, is we bring people from other organizations, from competitors into our workplace because of the value they bring, and then we try and mold them to fit exactly what we are. Enable them to be different, enable them to actually have that space to bring new things and thoughts to the table that you can actually think about in a really constructive way. And then the last thing I would say is, where is this journey taking us? I think it's really important that we don't have to necessarily have a defined output in terms of what we want this to do, other than making it better. There may well be times where we sit there and we look at the data and we look at the stats and get slightly disheartened because we're not making the progress that we want to. And I don't think that actually giving up or being dejected at that point is really useful. I think what we need to think about is, okay, so what can we learn from what has not necessarily gone well so far? How can we change some of these things? Do we need to bring in other people to help us review this slightly more objectively? So thinking about, actually, it's not about where we end up. We just need to get as many people on this bus with us to create that culture of belonging that we really want to. Again, just being kind. It's the one thing that has always stood out to me as leaders. They're the leaders that I emulate. If I look at our political landscape globally right now, who would I want, where would I want to live? Probably New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern and her kindness, but her strength and her empathy all combined into one, make her a formidable leader on the global scale. And that's definitely the sort of person that I would want to be working for, and I would want to be when I'm in a workforce. The final thing I'm going to show you is a quote. This is from Verna Myers, who is the Chief Diversity Officer at Netflix. And she says, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Now, for me, I love that quote, but I also don't like it in equal amounts. And the reason I don't is because as someone who's gay, as someone who's from a different ethnic minority, both of those two things are incredibly passive. I have to wait to be invited to the party, or I have to be asked to dance. That's why I extended it out as part of my studies when I was at Durham and met the team at NRG for the first time, to saying that belonging is choosing the music that goes on the playlist and bringing food to the buffet table. So that's what I want to leave you with. I want you to start thinking about, how do we bring people to feel like they can contribute? It will be different. The main thing I will leave you with is try and talk to people. Have that insight that's live, that's relevant to the people that are there. in your teams, in your workplaces. And that's how we will start creating more inclusive cultures, but also make sure that we're talking to people outside as well. So thank you very much for listening. I know that we only have a couple of minutes before 12:30. As I say, I'm happy to carry on. If there are people that have questions, please take yourself off mute. If you need to go at 12:30, put your hand up first and I will come to you first. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Chico. That was absolutely fantastic. And I just think your the addition to Werner Meyer's quote at the end just sums it up perfectly. It's a brilliant way to finish. Thank you very much. So over to questions. Has anybody got anything that they want to ask? Obviously, Chico is, as I say, he's available afterwards, but I'm sure he's also happy to continue the conversation on separately as well. If anybody wants your contact details, Chico.
Absolutely, yes. I didn't get to that slide, but I will make sure that when you get sent these out, my email address and website, which is Doing Diversity Differently, will be on the back of those. As I said, there will also be a list of resources, so some videos, some articles, some Twitter threads that you can start reading about that will help you on that journey in terms of some of your starting point for your reading list. But then be curious yourself. Take that and see what resonates with you. What are the messages that feel correct? What lands? And take that in terms of then finding the next piece that you want to read and learn more about.
Chico, could I
put your hand up there?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, just to say, I think it would be, I don't know if we could get people's contact details or anything, but certainly I've got a lot of experience around the kind of recruitment of BME staff and staff from an LGBT background as well. So if anybody wanted any hints or tips about how we managed to increase the kind of footfall through our recruitment, I'd be happy to provide that or support people, because again, it's about sharing experience, isn't it? Really, you'll all have experiences, I'm sure, that will be beneficial for me.
That's great, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick.
If anybody, if we can say it on the call, if anybody doesn't want their email address shared, let me know. Otherwise, if everybody's happy, we'll circulate everybody's email addresses so that you can keep in touch. It's probably more inclusive to turn around and say if you don't want it.
Absolutely.
Anyone else got any questions or thoughts? Scott, is there any final notes?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in because I mean, Chico and I have talked a lot about this, and the conversation started about 12 months ago now, just meeting at a party and just chatting. But I think with some of this, it's about moving from a compliance mindset to the positive aspects of considering inclusion and diversity. And then it comes down to, in some senses, the people on this call, you're kind of preaching to the converted in some senses, but you know, we've all learned something today, hopefully. But our real target audience is some of our clients who think either that they've got an adequate diversity policy, or that they're not considering this and they're missing out on talent. You know, when we go out and look for shortlists for people and then whittle them down, we've got to maximize the number of people that we're looking at, you know, and the messaging that goes out there. Nikki talked about it before, capturing people from a diverse background is the key. And Chico, you've talked before about sometimes getting 800% more applications. I think it was a local authority post, from getting the right messaging going out there, and that produces a stronger shortlist, produces better, I know it sounds cheesy, but stronger shortlist, better appointments, and the organizations benefit from hiring better people.
Absolutely, and I think it is really important that actually we think about how we move this away from it being compliance, because if it's done as a compliance point of view, your leadership team are never really going to truly believe in the skills that individual can bring. They are just kind of brought in as a tokenistic hire, or something like that, and they don't therefore have the mandate to be able to deliver on, because they haven't got the buy-in, they haven't got the support from the rest of the organization and the leadership team. So making sure that we can have those conversations with our leaders to enable us to be clumsily human on this learning, to start with, understand what those benefits are, and then truly figure out how we can create cultures using everybody within our place to actually make a difference is a really important thing. And I think that the more we do that, certainly the example that Scott was sharing was when I was working with the Mayor of London's office, so Greater London Authority, and they'd kind of just advertised in the way that they always did. And it was a really, standard Word document job description that didn't excite people. And we changed that. We sort of thought about how we can talk in different ways. How can we then put this out to different channels? How can we then target different people? And as Scott said, that increased the rate of applications by 870%. As an executive search firm, that was a little bit of a challenge for us, but one that we had to adapt to, and a fun challenge for us to adapt to. So that was really useful for us to think about what it was that we could do and how we could start considering people in a much more constructive way. I think, Lindsay, did you just have your hand up there? Or I think someone raised their hand up and then someone disappeared from the screen, so the hand stayed in a different place.
One of the suggestions just coming through on the chat box, Chico, is that we are creating part of a regional DI&B group, which I think is a fantastic idea, born out of today. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
And I would love to help support that. I mean, so as Scott said, my connection to the Northeast, you can tell I'm obviously not Northeast native. I certainly don't live in the Northeast, but I did study my master's there, and I met some amazing, wonderful people, some great businesses that I worked with as part of that. I know it's not quite the Northeast, I don't think, but I've done a lot of consulting in Leeds within the performing arts world. So it's a demographic that I understand. I certainly don't have all the answers and challenges, but I can help in terms of how we can push through a D&I steering group to help affect best practice and change and learn from each other in a constructive way. So I'd be more than happy to see how we can do that collaboratively.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're
Has
welcome.
anybody else got anything else before we sign off today? No. Chico, once again, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. I know in the planning of this, it's been quite difficult you work on different time zones because of the companies that you've been working with. So
indeed,
really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and possibly what is one of your sleeping times. But it's been absolutely fantastic. And I think we've got a lot of questions to follow up from that and some great suggestions there about us becoming a Northeast community to share practice on this. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us from for all of the board at NRG and Green Bean businesses. Please continue to drop any notes to us if you've got any suggestions or how you think we can improve or elaborate on what we've already done and discussed today. Love to hear from you. Love to hear if there's any thoughts you have on how we can get some of your leadership team involved in this journey rather than it all being passed to the HR side of things. So love to hear your ideas and thoughts on how we could help facilitate that, and leave you all to have a great rest of your day and see what else lockdown brings.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it, and it's been a pleasure. If there's anything that I can help with, then please do feel free to reach out.
Fantastic. We'll share all the slides and email addresses
Absolutely.
with everybody post-event, and anybody that hasn't made or would like a copy of the recording will also have that to share with you as well. So thanks very much everyone for joining us today, and thanks again to Chico.
Thank you.
Thanks
Take
guys.
care.
Bye.